Hello, everybody. David Roche here again. I want to talk to you about the US midterm elections. I think they are possibly the most vital elections we've seen globally in this decade. We need to focus on them. First of all, these are elections which apply to the whole of the Congress. The lower house is completely re-elected, and the upper house, a certain number of seats are re-elected. Now, what are the roles of both of these houses in Congress? Well, the House of Representatives, the lower house, initiates legislature. They come up with the ideas. The Senate approves those ideas or blocks them, and they go back and forth. They can be modified. But essentially, ideas come from the lower house, and they are approved or blocked in the upper house. Now, so far, Joe Biden's Democrats have controlled both houses. In this election, it is highly likely they will lose the lower house, so their ability to initiate policies will be reduced. They could well, given the 35 seats or so being contested in the upper house, lose the upper house as well, in which case this would become a lame duck presidency, which would have enormous consequences, which we'll come to. For the moment, the most likely outlook is that Biden loses the lower house, but Democrats retain control of the upper house. Now that's fine, you might say that's just democracy at work, and indeed it is, but you have to be very careful. The US is the example par excellence of democracy in the world, and at the same time, it is the example par excellence of political alienation in the world. So you always have to ask yourself, will the former survive the latter? These elections are very key because so many of the candidates are candidates which deny the results of the 2020 presidential election. If you deny the result of that election, you deny democracy, because it is quite clear that those elections were won fair and squarely by Joe Biden. The conspiracy theories of Trump and his very widespread support are not democratic, they are anti-democratic. Therefore, by voting for such candidates, you are furthering the cause of the alienation and polarization of US politics and society, and making it much more likely that such people, when in office, will degrade the workings, will degrade the checks and balances of democracy, which keep the greatest democracy in the world great, without Trump seeking to make it greater by doing away with it. All of this comes when the US Supreme Court, which surely, if things were finally balanced in the Senate, or indeed in the House of Representatives, would come into play, is dominated by conservatives. And in my view, by conservatives of very doubtful democratic credentials. So the risk I see going forward is not that exercising a vote is in some way not an exercise in democracy. It is, of course, it's what you're meant to do. But casting a vote for a candidate who denies the results of a democratically won election by President Biden 2020 is casting a vote against democracy. That vote will work its way into the next presidential elections, and it will work its way into the presidential elections after that. And in doing so, it will undo the workings of democracy. And it will mean that the US will move towards being a non-democratic state. That is the major risk. Now, why is that such a big risk? Well, I might answer by saying, well, what are we fighting for? Let us look at Ukraine. Let us look at China. We are fighting for a rule-based world order, which is rooted like a daisy in your lawn in democratic principles and legal principles. If we do not have the US as the guiding star in our firmament, that fight has a much higher probability of being lost by us liberals, Democrats, and supporters of legality. That matters because it strengthens China and it strengthens Russia and leaves vast swathes of what I should call emerging markets like India and Brazil in the grip of people whose rule may be nominally democratic, but whose doings are, to say the least, in democratic terms, doubtful. So the world would swing unanchored to a course which could well be disastrous. The second issue you want to bear in mind when casting a vote for people who deny the workings of democracy while standing in a democratic election is this. Ukraine, what are we fighting for? Well, we've already dealt with what the Russians are fighting for. They're not fighting to annihilate Ukraine, to commit genocide, which of course they are doing. They're fighting for the overthrow of Europe, the overthrow of American support for Europe, the return of America to its boundaries as a vastly weakened state, and the establishment of a world order in which small states' rights are not recognized, but big states, particularly big autocratic states, have all the rights. That's what they're fighting for. So it is not just a war about Ukraine. Now, what are we fighting for if we do not have a democratic ideal, flawed as it may be, but nevertheless soundly rooted in democracy in the United States? And the answer is, I think, the solidarity upon which Ukraine depends to win, and there is no option but winning this war. That solidarity would fraction, not within years, but within months. Let me give you an example. Of the aid going to Ukraine, approximately 15 billion US dollars of financial aid, 10 billion of humanitarian aid, and 28 billion of military aid comes from the United States. Now, that aid is measured by the Kiel Institute on its website of the Ukraine Support Tracker. So it's neutral. It's not propaganda. That amount of aid from the United States, 28 billion plus 10 billion, 38 billion total, plus call it 15 billion. So call it $55 billion. So 0.7% of US GDP is bigger than all of the aid coming from all the European countries. For example, European institutions have given about 12 billion in terms of financial aid. But if you take military aid, it's minute. The United Kingdom and places like the Baltic states and Finland are very good at giving aid in terms of their GDP, which is of course small. But the figures themselves tell a stark tale. If the US splits on its support for Ukraine, the war is over. There is no way that that amount of aid could be replaced or would be replaced by anybody else. What you would immediately see is Putin getting his dearest wish, freezing the Ukrainians and imposing energy hardship on Europe to the degree that negotiations start to take place. And he is put in a position where no matter how small his gains in terms of territorial winning, he can go home and say, I declare victory. There is no way in which the current world disorder of three blocs, Russia and China, though very different in their aspirations and leanings and actions, the emerging markets in their moral indifference, such as India and Brazil, South Africa, and I can go on, and the Western, in inverted commas, liberal democracies. There is no way in which a Gleichgewicht, a balance of power, can be achieved between these entities unless the US is leading the liberal democracies. Otherwise, that side of the equation would simply collapse, opening itself up to the dominance of far, there's only one word for horrible leadership. That is the significance of the US elections that are now coming up. The midterms kind of strike a chord of being, oh, well, it's only, these seats here and those seats there, and it doesn't really matter. There's normally a vote against whoever the incumbent president is, this way and that way. This time, that is simply not true. These are vital elections, vital for democracy in the US, vital for world order, vital for the war which Russia is fighting against us all. Think about it and do not cast a vote for somebody who does not believe in the power of that vote. Democracy is at stake. Thank you.